Hi everyone, it's Jen from Around the World in 80 Cakes again, and today I'm actually filling and frosting a small round cake, and I thought why don't I take a video of it so that way I can share some of the methods that I use to fill and frost my cakes and some tips that I've come across along the way, and see if they give you a hand and help you out when you're frosting your cakes. So most importantly, the first thing I have to start with are my cakes. So I bake my cakes in 2-inch deep pans. So I have 2 of them. And these cakes are actually cold. So typically what I'll do is I'll bake my cake, let it cool for about an hour, and then I wrap it in plastic wrap and put it in the fridge for at least 6 to 8 hours. I usually just leave it overnight, come back the next day to frost it. Cold cake I think is much easier to handle, and it's just less crumbly when you go to cut it and do things with it. So that's what I'm starting out with. I'm going to unwrap my cake, and the one thing I should mention is I always start with the bottom of the cake as the top of my final cake. So for example, this is actually the top of the cake, but what I want to do is when I actually go to stack my cakes, I'm going to flip it so that the bottom, which is the flattest part of the cake, is facing up. That will give you a nice level cake. The other thing you'll notice with this cake is that it's actually pretty level. If you ever bake a cake and you get a nice dome going on there, it's actually not that nice. There are ways around getting away from that. So what I actually use is something called a cake strip. So I'll show you what that looks like. So this is just a cake strip. They come in different sizes. You can find them online. Craft stores are always a good place as well. Basically what you do is you soak this in water and wet it, wring it out, and then you wrap it around your pan. And it comes with some little pins to pin it. And what this is actually going to do is cool down the sides of the pan. So the reason you get a dome on your cakes is because the sides of the cake bake faster since they're in contact with the hot side of the pan, and they set faster while the middle is still baking and still rising. That's why you get that dome. By cooling down the side of the pan, you actually make the middle and the sides bake at about the same rate so that you get a nice flat cake. That way you don't have to actually worry about leveling it. Now if I did have a dome, what I would use typically is this nice little tool that's called a leveling tool, and the sides adjust up and down so you can kind of see where they line up and basically slide it across and trim off that dome. I don't have to do that with this cake since it's pretty level. I'm going to leave it as is. But you can also use this to torte the cake. So torting the cake is when you slice the cake each layer in half so that you can put an extra layer of filling in between. So that's what I'm going to do here. So usually what I do to start with that is I take some toothpicks and I put them one towards the top of the cake. Move that over a little bit, maybe you can see. And then one directly underneath it towards the bottom of the cake. And then when I cut the cake, I'm going to cut in between those 2 toothpicks. And what that does is it gives me a guide so that when I combine these 2 layers back together, I know exactly where they started from, and they'll line up exactly where they're supposed to be. Now that's very important, especially if you don't cut level and you have a slant. You don't want to put them back on top of each other incorrectly, because then your cake's going to be lopsided. So these are going to be my guides. So to torte, you can use your leveling tool, or you can just use a big serrated knife. This is just a bread knife. I am not the best at cutting level, cutting straight across. But I still often use this, especially when it's on larger cakes that this little tool doesn't, is too small for. I still go with the knife. And again, if you keep your toothpicks in line, even if you cut it slanted, it's going to be fine. So just about the middle of the cake. This is a 2-inch cake, so about 1 inch up from the bottom. And I'll rotate it so that I can kind of see where I'm going and hopefully cut somewhat level. And then come out the other side there. Alright, so this is a nice small dense cake, so it's easy to handle. So I have my toothpicks in, I'm ready to go. Alright, so now I'm going to move on to my turntable. So this is just a nice little cake turntable. You can use any kind of Lazy Susan or turntable you find, but I do find they're helpful when frosting a cake. And I have a cake cardboard. So this is a cardboard that is food safe. It is specifically made for cake. They come in sizes and shapes that match the sizes and shapes of all the different kinds of cake pans. So again, you can find them online, you can find them in craft stores. So I'm going to use that. And then I also have, I do have my big bowl of frosting, which I'll bring out in a minute, but I have a pastry bag filled with that frosting with a number 12 round tip. So I'm going to use this actually when we get to our filling as well. Now, if you don't have a pastry bag, you can always use a parchment paper pastry bag or make one out of a Ziploc or zipper plastic bag. And I do have some videos on how to do that, so you can check out those on my website if you want to see how to do that. But for this, I'm just actually going to squirt a little frosting on my cardboard so that my cake will stick to it. What I actually like to do is flip it onto the cake, and I can do this for smaller cakes. For larger cakes, that might be a little bit tricky. And then just flip it like that. And then you can kind of move it around, get it so that it's centered on the cardboard. Okay, so now I have my layer ready for filling. Now my filling that I'm going to use today is chocolate ganache. And again, I have a recipe for this on my website, so if you want to know what my ganache recipe is, you can check it out. And I have a little spatula I'm going to use to apply it. But before I put the filling, this is where I use my pastry bag. So whenever I have a filling that is different from my frosting, I use one of these bags to basically make a nice little bridge, or dam, I guess, barrier, whatever you want to call it. I'm just squirting it around the edge of the outside of the cake. Now when I put the filling on the inside and spread it around and put the next layer on, my filling won't squirt out the sides. It has a little protective layer there. Okay, so then I just use my spatula and scoop some filling and spread it around. And this is where the turntable comes in very handy. I spin as I'm spreading, and it helps me get a nice even layer of the filling. And sometimes if the cake shifts, I'll put a little like grippy, non-sticky thing underneath it that I have. So if you have anything like a non-skid mat that you can stick underneath it for smaller cakes, that's really important. But this one's not doing too bad. Alright, so that looks nice and level. Alright, so now I'm ready to put my next layer on top. So if I move all this out of the way, I have my toothpick over here, so when I flip this onto it, I want to make sure that my toothpicks line up. So there's my toothpick. And top. So you want the toothpicks to line up, and you want the edges also to line up so that they're not, one isn't hanging over the other. And you'll see, so like I said, this is the bottom of the cake now facing up because it's nice and flat. So I'm all lined up. I can take my toothpicks out, save them for the next tier. And then I like to press down. This will help get out any air bubbles, and you can see that nice little bridge that I talked about. It is squeezing out the sides, so it was good that we put that there because otherwise we'd have ganache all over the outside of our cake. So I just like to push down, make sure all my sides are lined up. You can usually slide it back and forth a little bit. You have a little wiggle room, but that looks good. We can put another layer of filling on right now. So I will do my nice little barrier of buttercream again. And if you're ever worried, you could even do a second in barrier. You just get a little less filling. So now this is ready for my next tier. So just like we did before, I unwrap it. This time I'll use the little leveling tool to actually cut my cake in half. And I always like to leave it on the plastic wrap so that I don't get the counter too super dirty. Put my toothpicks in. Again, make sure they're lined up, one top, one bottom. Now the way these leveling tools work is they have little ridges along the sides that allow you to adjust the height. And you want to make sure that each side is the same height, otherwise you'll still get a slant. So I'm actually going to put it on the lowest level because I basically want it to be right in the middle of the cake, and that's perfect, right in the middle of the cake. And then in between your toothpicks, make sure you're in between, you just hold onto the cake and then rock it back and forth, and it's kind of like a wire cheese cutter. It just slices it right in half. There we go. Nice and easy. So again, this is the top of my cake, which I'm going to flip over and place on there. And again, push down and make sure that it's in line on the sides. That looks good. All right, last layer of filling. Okay, so once again, lining up our toothpicks so that we're nice and straight. Take that a little bit. And press down. So like I said, this pressing down helps get out any air bubbles. I think I might have mentioned that. Now the next step, you'd think, okay, we're ready to frost. Well, what I like to do is take my spatula, so this is just a nice long spatula, and all that buttercream that's kind of flailed out, I sort of press it down, smooth it out around the sides. And now what I'm going to do is actually use a knife. Again, I like to use this big bread knife. And I'm going to go around and actually trim the sides of the cake. Now this isn't something you have to do, but basically it's going to make the sides of the cake, make sure that they're even. It does get a little messy, which I already am. But I like to do it because I do feel like then when I go to frost the cake, I get a much nicer kind of look to it. So I'm actually going to grab a bowl to put all those scraps in, which I always make a nice snack. Alright, so really I just use the top of the cake as a guide, and depending on how the cake has been baked, it really may not have much that comes off. But I just try and keep the knife straight up and down and just go around along the top. And this is especially good like if there is one side that's sort of sticking out, then you'll make sure that when you go to frost it, you don't end up having like this bulge of cake in the middle of the side of the cake. Okay, so there really wasn't that much. So I just kind of scooped the little crumbs. But you can see the sides look much, much cleaner now. Alright, so before we start frosting, which we are almost ready to do, I'm going to get a wet paper towel and just wipe off, I'm kind of using my finger to do it, I'm going to wipe my hands off and I'm going to wipe the sides of my turntable so that I don't, when I go to frost it, I don't end up getting crumbs in my frosting. Especially with chocolate cake, getting crumbs in the frosting can be very, very, just drive you crazy. I've been there where they just keep appearing. So I'm going to show you how you can avoid that in a minute.